Welcome to Taste the Mango and another one of our videos where we're going to do an exploration into a core question behind non-duality. Now, today, Katrijn and I have decided we wanted to look at something that may feel a little bit wide and will need a little bit of pointing out to in language as well as experiencing experientially. And the question is, what is the mind? Now, as you even hear that, there's going to be hundreds of different ways that we could look at that phrase. So we're going to need to put a little bit of distinction into it. So Katrijn, do you want to start us off by pulling apart a couple of the elements that we want this inquiry, when we get into it, to demonstrate?
Yeah, and just to frame it a little bit, when we talk about inquiry, we're often saying we're looking at beyond the mind, or before the mind, or before the psychological, or before psychology. So many times there's this sort of assumption that we know what we're talking about when we say look before the mind or beyond the mind. And it gets confusing because the word mind is used in different ways. But what we want to look at here is there something called my personal mind? So which many people would assume is located in the brain, or it's in my head somewhere. And of course, we can distinguish consciousness, universal mind. Some people speak of mind in that way, but I think most people listening to this, when they hear the word mind, they think of, body, mind, and that's my personal mind.
Yeah.
And then there are various theories about what the mind, how it works, different systems in the brain, Freudian psychology and theories of mind. But we want to really look at just this idea that I have, this body has a personal mind. And how do we know that? How do we know that that exists?
So we're going to look at to see whether there is this, if you can ever find what we would call a personal my mind. And we also want to look at the different ways what turns up in awareness does, and how we can then confuse that, thinking they're different things to each other. So, for example, I was always taught, and many people were conditioned this way, that there's a conscious mind and a subconscious mind. So there might be visible thoughts that I have that I can identify and go, well, there's a thought. Oh, that's definitely my mind. But then there's other things that live in my subconscious that are still influencing what I perceive and behave, but I'm not cognitively aware of them. And then that's different to the stuff that shows it visibly. And then that might be different to what we're calling awareness, which is big mind or universal mind or consciousness or whatever it is. So automatically, regardless of the psychological theory you've got, and that could complicate it even more, we have been taught there are separate parts of the human experience that are not all the same system. So maybe we'll give this a little go experientially, and then we'll kind of do a timeout and a bit of description or explanation on what was going on. So, Katrijn, do you want to start by asking me some questions, and I'll do the inquiry and you ask me the questions?
Yeah, so if you were to look for your mind, where would you look?
Sort of what's in front of my mind's eye, which is what's appearing to me in perception right now, which would be a screen, a light, my hands if I do this. That would be my mind. And then the thoughts I have, I can hear my voice. That's all where I'd looked. So what's going on? I would look to what's going on for me.
Mm. And then kind of implied, I think, is that's internal to you within the body.
So some things would be internal, like a thought that I could hear. Some things I would, I've been taught to call the outside world, like my screen and my, and sounds. But centered around the body, yes.
Mm. Okay, so the exact location is not very clear.
But me centric. I mean, I wouldn't think that what's going on in Israel right now has anything to do with my mind.
Yeah. So there's a locality to it.
Yeah, it feels like there is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It could appear to be.
And you just described two aspects, sort of sensations or perceptions, sense perceptions, and mental content, thinking, ideas.
Mm.
Maybe we can add, inspiration, daydreams, different.
Yeah, so sometimes my experience might be very, what I would say, literal to the here and now. That's what it would look like. So, okay, there's a screen, I'm seeing the screen, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes I might get a thought that would appear more random, like it would come from some, I just had a great thought. You know what we could do? We could do this in this video. So it would feel like it came from somewhere else. Still sort of me, but not quite so attached to the logic of what I was doing, maybe.
Mm. So, and we can imagine that, I don't know, someone with schizophrenia would have, visions or hear other voices, and still this would be the content of their minds.
Yeah, absolutely. So you go, and you might even, when they start talking about it, you might think, what, where they got that from? So yeah, so my mind would feel like their mind didn't get on, my mind and them.
Yeah. And so there's a clear difference between the content of what I call my mind, and then you or someone else telling me.
Yeah, it would definitely appear like there's a difference between my mind and someone else's mind.
Okay, so if we take this content of the mind, right, thoughts, sensations, visions, schizophrenic visions, anything that is possible, beyond that content, can you find anything that you can call the mind?
Well, there is what's there when the activity of that content isn't there.
Yeah.
And I recognize that.
So if we just use these words as a little bit of a help, there's the content of the mind, let's call that the content, and then there's the container.
Or the capacity in the content. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
And when we say my mind, we're sort of assuming that the container is this personal mind.
Well, I would have used to have said that, most definitely. I kind of now know a little different, because
exactly. Why or how? How do you know?
Well, because I can't find an edge. There's lots of ways, but I can't, for example, find an edge to my container.
Yes.
So if it was my container, surely it would start and stop and be finite. Whereas the container, the capacity, is never ever not there. So it doesn't stop in time. It doesn't stop in space. It's completely continuous. And it's not mine because it doesn't share the same qualities as what my thinking or my perceiving is. And it doesn't really care about them either. So the capacity, the container, doesn't get damaged or put off by what the content is. So it doesn't actually feel like mine at all, apart from the thought that comes in and goes, is that not yours? But, it doesn't feel like it at all. No, they feel really quite distinct.
the question that immediately comes up is that, but then why do we only know our personal thoughts?
Yeah.
The container not know all thoughts.
Yeah. And the way I would look at that is there's an individuation to what turns up in awareness that I have attention of. That's individuated. I don't have 7 billion people's thoughts, thank God. I'd be very busy if I did. Occasionally you get a real instinctive sense that you know what someone else is thinking. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But sometimes you feel like you can cross that veil. But just because it's individuated does not mean it's separate. The two might correlate, but one doesn't cause the other. And I go back to the whirlpool in the water. It's so just because I don't have the same thoughts as someone else, but then I see someone else is also part of my content. So where would that ever? I would have to then make a separation about the other person being separate for me to have a separate mind as well.
Yeah. I think it's helpful maybe to take a step back, because we assume my mind is in my body.
Yeah.
Right? It's body mind.
Yes.
And so as soon as we assume that I am the separate body mind,
yeah,
it becomes personal.
Yes, because on that theory, if I was standing next to someone, I maybe would have their thoughts. But I couldn't have the thoughts of someone in America right now. Because if body is the house, houses the mind, then it would be linked to that. Whereas remote viewing, our experience of people have remote viewing where they can view something in another location that their body isn't in. And in dreams, we're very good at that. And in imagination, we're very good at that. But we've been taught that in waking reality, that doesn't happen.
Yes, and we're assuming that we're in the body.
Yeah, because we're assuming we're in the body. I mean, we see that's why it doesn't happen. We go, oh, that doesn't happen because we're in the body. Not for any of the thousands of reasons of that why that wouldn't happen. So
if we turn it around to what we explore in these videos, and we say there is an infinite consciousness mind, an eternal awareness in which all content appears, including the body mind that calls itself Piers. Then we could say that the idea of the personal mind is also something appearing within that body mind.
But yeah, because the idea that of me and me being a body mind is an appearance, just like a thought about, oh, I had a nice lunch.
Yeah.
And it comes and goes. I mean, it's a more consistent one than lunch, but it has exactly the same qualities as any other thought.
Yes.
Apart from being a little more consistent. So it's not fundamental. It's once you look, I can see it's not fundamental. It's an idea.
It's an added concept that we had to. I mean, you ask a small child, it doesn't know anything about a mind, about a personal mind. It just knows raw sensations.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so going back to the beginning of this discussion, if we look just at raw sense data, can we find anything that we could call my personal mind?
So if I go to raw sense data without any conditioning or assumptions or correlation making, then you can't, bizarre as it may sound, you can't actually find anything, my mind, apart from a thought that you've had this condition saying my mind and body. Apart from that, which appears, you cannot find it. You wherever you look, you can't find it, apart from it being a thought.
Yes.
And we have thoughts about all sorts of things we don't believe them. So just because it's a thought doesn't mean it's fundamental. So you can't actually find it, and it's the bizarrest thing not to be able to find, because you would assume you can, but when you look in this way of an inquiry, you're like, actually, I can't, and you almost can't believe you can't find it. It's not there. Really, really isn't. In raw experience, it is just not there.
So if we drop the concept of my mind, and even just the concept of mind in general, what is there?
There's just the coming and going of thought, feeling, and perception. Some of those, if you put the conditioning back in, would be like, well, they're mine, and some of them wouldn't. But if you didn't have the conditioning of mind, they're all the same. They're all just an arising of psychological content and a dissolving.
Yes.
A content coming and going in a container.
And
there's no specialized my stuff.
So the saying it is mine doesn't even make sense, because what are we calling, what is my referring to?
I guess if you had to be kind to the my word, it's referring to what in this moment turns up for you as an apparent separate self to the universe and others. So it's a way of going, oh, I had a thought that it's not very nice weather today, and I acknowledge that you, appearing separate other, might think it's lovely today, right? So that's why we use the word my.
Yeah. So as a way of relating between apparently separate body minds.
Yeah. But knowing we're all part of the same, like two leaves on a tree having a chat. It's all part of the same system.
Yes. Yes. And that's maybe a great analogy to kind of round it off with, because it would be like, the leaf saying to the other leaf, well, this is my thought because it occurred in my leaf system.
Yeah. And as we look at a tree, we think that's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
1,000 leaves, they all think they're separate, bless them. Now, from the perspective of the leaf, it can appear like I'm going back out of the metaphor now. From the perspective of my localized mind, it can appear as mine and localized. But what I can't always recognize because of my conditioning is, oh no, it isn't. And then the other bit to put in would be this distinction we mentioned at the beginning between, which I think blurs the lines, is some things very much feel like they're thoughts you can own and have and recognize, like a cognitive thought that comes in, like I enjoyed my lunch, and you can go, well, that was my thought, it came in on my terms, sort of thing. And then there's this, what we get told, this unconscious stuff that's all bubbling away underneath that we don't really know about, but it's still influencing perception, thought, and feeling. And I think we confuse that one, the invisible thought, with the container. But that's still not the container.
Yes.
That's still not the container. So the thing we're asking people to spot when we're doing inquiry into non-duality and what we essentially are isn't, oh yeah, spot there's something going on before the visible thought turns up.
Yeah.
We're saying, yes, there will be, because you don't know where anything comes from, but we're going to something much more we're going to the container, the space, which is neutral, which is infinite, and all that. So, Katrijn, what would it be if someone's listening to this question about what is the mind, and they have a conditioning that says there's this conscious and subconscious mind, and when we look at my mind, they would say, well, some of my thoughts I'm not always aware of them, but they are coming from a part of me that's kind of buried or something. Let's do a little. So some people may not have that thinking, in which case don't listen to this because it will just be confusing. But if people have that kind of thinking, which some people do, I know, let's lean into that for a bit. So right now, where would you say your thoughts, feelings, and perceptions are coming from?
They just appear.
They just appear. And is any of that look like or appear it's coming from something to do with who you are at the sort of self or localized level?
That's really difficult because I know the distinction used to exist, but I can't find it. So anything that comes up, literally anything, it just appears. And none of it feels even personal.
Right. So if you were to have a very Katrijn type thought, maybe your husband would say, well, that's a very Katrijn thing. Or someone on LinkedIn might say, well, I knew you'd say that. Or you do a behavior or have a preference that's kind of on type for you.
Yeah.
How different is that to you having a random thought that you never had before?
So this is a fascinating question because as you asked that, I realized there's absolutely no difference, but there used to be a huge difference. There used to be thoughts that felt uniquely me, and even thoughts that I would say I came up with. Whereas now, if I tell the truth, as I see it, it just comes up because I can have the most random, weird thoughts coming up all the time. And then there are those that the past would say, oh, these are typical because they've come up before. But it's all just mental activity.
It's all mental. I hear that, and it's all mental. It's all content in the container, in the capacity. But if you were to very neutrally do what would be a very tedious exercise, and over a month or a week or even a day, note down the thoughts that were repetitive. They come more than once, and the new ones. My guess is you would find a cluster. If you did a cluster analysis, you would find some thoughts are more repetitive than others. Would that be?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then if 10 people did that, you would find that their repetitive thoughts would be more local to them, right? So someone had those cluster. So whereas they're all coming in the same, what do you think, or what do you see about that, and why some of those thoughts cluster as looking like localized or yours?
Well, they appear more often. And they seem to be about a self.
They're more self-referential. Yeah. Right. And this is not really an inquiry question, it's more a reflective question, but what do you think the point of that is?
The point of that thinking?
Well, why would the system have that?
As a way to think about itself, to reference itself, to interact, maybe.
And why would it have why would we have individual, why would our clusters be relatively unique to us?
I don't know.
And I think that's key, isn't it? Because if we really ask ourselves, we don't know. We could come up with lots of theories as to why, and you could write academic papers on the theories as to why. But do we really know what's going on there?
No, and I even have to really, in this moment, question whether I know that these thoughts are local. How do I know that?
Well, there are certain thoughts that you can tell me about. But during this exercise, you'd have to have cognition, meta re-representation of the thought to tell me. Now,
Yes.
Here's a silly question. Are you capable of telling about thoughts you haven't had?
No.
Localized you haven't had? No. So is it possible there's all sorts of things happening that don't get re-represented into the cognitive mind?
Yes.
And all we're doing when we think we have all these localized patterns is showing what our localized mind is reproducing.
Yes, or picking up, if we want to think of it as a radio receiver.
Right. And therefore it's bound to, if you think about it, it's a complete tautology. It's a vicious circle, or not vicious, but it's just a lovely thing. What happens is it's bound to look like it's separate, because the only thing the separate mind can find is the separate thoughts that it's aware of, and everything else doesn't get re-represented into cognition.
Yes.
Now that's just a theory made up, but if you look directly, that's just as feasible as
it makes sense. Yeah. It seems to fit. It fits the picture, including that the thoughts that are out there but are not picked up or re-represented, are not mine either, or they're not local. They're just sort of floating out there in space.
Right.
And so are neither mine nor yours, but ours.
And have you ever had the experience, I'm asking you to go and re-represent now, where you've been in what I would call a really expanded aperture? Maybe you've been very, very, some people might call a heightened state of awareness, or something like that, or on psychedelics, or ayahuasca or something, where you really do feel like there's a new level of thought coming in. Creativity, we would call it. Inspiration, we would call it. Collectiveness, we might call it, if we're in a collective. That isn't always available when you're in a more contracted aperture than when you're in a more, and again, these are lots of concessions here, but in a more expanded place. Has that been a direct experience of yours?
In my current and most current experience, there is no sense of the thoughts being personal anymore.
Right. But they can change although I know you've got no sense of personal, but referencing memory, which is really unreliable, but it's all we've got to go on. It feels like there was a time in your life where you had less bandwidth, if you like, and more.
Yes, there was more self-referential thought.
Yeah. And you were less connected, to use another concession word, to the wider whatever. Right.
Yeah. I would say the thinking back and trying to reproduce that, the experience was one of constant self-referential thought, almost crowding out any option of other or different or more.
Yeah. Because in the billions of possibilities of how thought could manifest, we get like, they say 70,000 a day, neuroscientists came up with, right? But that is still infinitesimally small into the possibility of what thought could be and perception.
And just as a final maybe footnote, I think many of us have had the experience of being in groups, small, large events, sometimes cathartic events, where really big emotions and things are happening. And we realize that when people share the thoughts that they are having, that they are our thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's often this, experience of, wow, they're thinking the same, those are my thoughts, they're thinking my thoughts. And might it not be just as obvious or just as good an explanation that these thoughts are out there and are being picked up by the group, by different individuals in the group simultaneously?
And a lovely example of that for me was when I remember when my kids were about 6 or 7, and it just seems to happen at this age, they would say things that I would describe as just wise beyond their years about a situation, about a person, and they would just come out of their mouth, and you're like, did you, 6 years old, say that? And it was like a very wise thought, which their conceptual experience would not allow them to have.
Yes.
So where's that come from? Right. And now you put it down as, just a one-off, but the more you start to see, you see, no, if it's also a localized thought, then this 6-year-old who's a dumbass in the game of life should not be able to have that insight, that wisdom.
Yes.
But you start to see it's available.
Yeah.
So coming back to our grand question, what is the mind? From the direct inquiry perspective, what's the answer?
Well, it almost now sounds like the mind is that in which everything appears, including all possible thoughts that are then expressed or not expressed, become conscious or almost like little islands appearing out of the sea of an ocean of mind, little localized,
And can you find this my mind thing?
No, I can find, as we discussed, thoughts that seem to be localized here, but I have no way of knowing that these are mine.
Yeah. So they can appear to be localized to the body mind. They can appear to be self-referential to my life because they're relevant, but that's just the beauty of the system. But they're never different to any other random, imaginary, fantastical thought or fresh thought. They're not really different. So all the appearances of my mind, or it being my mind from a body perspective, is dotted line. There's nothing solid in that.